when you leave here? What do you want to be armed with? Yeah.
So I guess my main concern is really the distinction between research and development. And
Okay.
I guess when you're developing the underlying foundation of a technology, how much of that needs to be figured out before you actually implement a quality system.
And then how does that affect your quality management system? Okay. What else? Got other questions? We're fielding questions, things you want to get answered as part of this course today. So.
Just how best to perform the documentation that's needed for regulatory approval.
Okay. A bad habit of abbreviating everything, so if you don't understand something, ask me.
Russ, along with Pablo's question, when's the best, I guess, the distinction between your early feasibility design, like we had briefly talked about before, and then also when do design controls come into play after you've established that?
So you should put question marks after all these. Anything else?
So I buy products to develop Chinese market. So I want to learn compare the different with the Chinese medical regulatory.
Okay. And in China, they have the SFVDA, right? So that's the morning.
Hi, how are you?
We're fielding questions in terms of things you would like to walk away with today for having spent your time with us. Do you have any burning questions that you want to get answered today? What about you, sir? Anything back there? So.
Well, for somebody who's new bringing a device through this, what would you say are your top 3 or 5 biggest hurdles that we might not know about?
Okay, yep. That's a good question. Okay. Yes.
Hi, Russ. Diana Colville. It's been a
Hi,
long
Diana.
time. Former president CEO of Pearl Pathways.
Okay.
It's been, I sold my half the company last summer, and I'm an entrepreneur in residence here.
Okay, very good.
At the Purdue Foundry, and 2 of my device clients here at the Foundry got conflicts. They may be in or out, so I'm going to be taking lots of notes for them because I'm trying to convince them that it's never too early to start
You're right.
thinking about design controls
Yes.
and customer inputs and documenting that.
Yes.
But it's so hard to really right size the method to do that in a startup that's still in an academic lab and is beginning to transition out maybe and think about it, and they have no money. And so I guess the primer, the 101 of what's really realistic for a bootstrapped startup and when they start thinking about it. We just had a session, the shakeout session at the Foundry this week, that it's never too early to think about pricing. You really have to think about pricing and reimbursement from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And they did a great job of sort of giving our startups some takeaways for the 4 or 5 things they still have to nail down. So things that we sort of really how-tos that could be a resource for our Foundry clients that we could use and the EIRs could take back whenever we're working with a life science client would be very helpful.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, in fact, Dana and I were talking about reimbursement this morning. Sometimes reimbursement can affect the way you structure your clinical trials.
It usually does, yes,
Yeah.
if you're gonna, yeah.
Yeah, so that's something that, you know, you need to be aware of fairly early on.
And did you introduce yourself already? I don't know what you're up to now.
Oh.
But just
Well-
here, I mean, you'll get to that. I just want to make sure I hadn't
Yeah.
missed it, because I hadn't heard about Eagle Creek Engineering.
There I am.
And then I have another one, but I'm not
Uh-huh.
sure, is the IVD process and
Uh-huh.
how it differs from sort of traditional medical devices for
Okay.
in vitro diagnostics. And I know it's very different now with Europe, but at least in US.
Yeah.
Because Europe would be a whole other talk.
Well, you know, in Europe, we've got the MDRs and the IVDRs coming in next year, right?
Right.
So that warps a lot of things. Okay, any other questions? Those were all great questions. All right, well, there I am, that's who I am. That's what I do. So, we're gonna talk a little bit, one of the things that Dana and Will asked for was, you know, kind of a front to back understanding of what does medical device development look like, okay? And then I've got a couple of bolt-ons where we're going to talk about outsourcing, we're going to talk about software development, because those are kind of different animals. And so we're going to have a front to back look at how do you get your medical device from an idea on a napkin to an approved product in the market.
And will these slides be available to us?
Yes.
Yes.
I had asked Reza to send those out. I don't know if she's gotten an email yet this morning.
Okay.
But if not,
Great, thank you.
I'll send them out.
Yeah, the slides belong to Dane, they're his property, so I just cooked them up for him. So the first thing to know is that the FDA manages everything on a risk-based approach, okay? And no matter what they do, no matter what you do with them, it'll all come down to a risk-based approach. Now the question is, risk to whom? Okay, and it all is about risk to public. Okay, that's what the FDA cares about. That's what their charter is. They're there to protect the public from bad pharmaceuticals and bad medical devices. Okay, and they take their job very seriously. The greater the risk, the greater the controls. So to facilitate that differentiation of how much is enough, the FDA uses 3 classifications for devices, 1 being the lowest risk classification, 3 being the highest risk classification. You can see examples there of the types of devices that fall into those classifications. Most devices tend to fall into the class 2 classification, but not all. And one thing to understand is when the FDA does not understand a device, they tend to want to make it a class 3. And in fact, as we'll talk about class 2 devices, the whole 510K program is an old legacy program based on what's called predicate devices. And if you don't have a predicate, then you end up becoming a de novo 510K candidate. Because what happens is if you don't have a predicate, you automatically go to a class 3 classification. And then you have to argue your way back to class 2. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So 3 classifications based on risk. Okay, in terms of regulatory controls and pathways, these generally line up: general controls class 1, 510K class 2, pre-market approval class 3. But as you can see, the first bullets and under the sub-bullets on these say, for most class 1s and select class 2s, for most class 2s and select class 3s and 1s. So there's not total consistency in these classifications and their regulatory pathways. So we're going to talk a little bit about regulations and product codes. And those are how we figure out what we have to do in terms of our submissions to the FDA for pre-market clearance or approval. Okay. Pre-market notification is different from pre-market approval. This goes back to the 1976 implementation of the medical device regulations, where when the regulations, I'm old enough, I can tell you I was around when there were no regulations, but when the regulations came in 76, a lot of manufacturers said, well, wait a minute, you're now making us do all of these submissions, and everything at the time the FDA was talking about was going through full pre-market approval, which is kind of similar to the way a drug gets approved. It's very rigorous, okay? And a lot of manufacturers were going, well, we already have products of this type on the market. We don't want to go through all of this rigor to get a device approved that's just like a device that's already out there. That's not fair to us. And so the FDA came back and said, okay, we'll create the 510K program, 510K being part of the regulations, Regulation 5 subsection K, or 510 subsection K. And they said, well, okay, if you can point to a predicate device, which is a legal term, and you can demonstrate that that predicate device is substantially equivalent, okay, or your new device is substantially equivalent to your older predicate device, you can go this less burdensome pathway, as they refer to it, okay, which is the difference between a pre-market notification and a pre-market approval is pre-market notification, you tell the FDA, we're going to market with this device, and the FDA requires you to submit to tell them what you're doing and how you did it. And then the FDA comes back and says, gives you clearance. Says, okay, we agree this device is safe enough to go to market. Pre-market approval, the FDA actually stands in your way before you go to market. And they say, well, no, you can't go to market until we've had a chance to really fully vet this design in your quality system, and you have to go through, in addition to other things, a pre-approval inspection for a Class 3 device. So, so to get around all of this burden that they were going to put in through the regulations, the FDA came out with the 510K program, which allowed you to point to a device that was currently in the market, and now it's a device in the market and approved by the FDA, and then say, well, our device is just like that one, and then demonstrate that it is through this exercise called substantial equivalence. So here's a flow chart, front to back process for going from an idea to a product in the market. Any questions? Want to break for lunch? Okay. We're going to break down each section of this flow chart, but I wanted to have at least one slide where you could see the whole thing front to back, so you could then piece together the bits and pieces we're going to work through. So, how do we get started? I got an idea for a medical device. How do we get started? Okay. First question is your product a medical device or not? Sometimes we have products that look like they are, but maybe aren't. Sometimes we have products that are medical devices, but the FDA is not enforcing. For example, if you have a smartphone app, and it might be a medical device, but the FDA might not care right now because they're under enforcement discretion on smartphone apps that are medical devices. So you may not have to do anything. But here's the problem. They can change their mind. And if they change their mind, you've got about 6 months to get yourself caught up. So, and you can't build a quality system and get it up and running in 6 months. So you need to think about that. If you're operating in that enforcement discretion area, you need to have some sort of strategy for what do we do if they change their mind. Okay, so this is the technical FDA legal definition of a medical device. It's up there. So if you fall into any of those, if you answer yes to any of those questions, then you're a medical device. So then how do we get started? So if your product is a medical device, and if you're not sure, we can ask the FDA. There's a mechanism by which we can ask the FDA. It's called a request for designation, RFD, and it's referred to as a 513G, which is the regulation number. And so we can send in a 513G, and they will come back and say, yes, this is a medical device, or no, it's not. And they will tell you the regulation and product code it's managed under, or regulated under, if it is a medical device. So an RFD, like I said, they'll tell you whether they, if it's a device or not. A lot of times we'll send in 513Gs for combination products. And the reason we'll do that is because it may be unclear as to what the combination who will regulate the combination? You know, for example, I've got a client that has, it's an in vitro diagnostic test, but the patient takes a drug before they measure, and then the drug is expressed in urine, and then they measure the urine, so it's a urine test, but they take a drug first. So that's a combination product, because we've got a regulated device and we've got a regulated drug. But the question was, well, which center manages that combo product in the FDA? Is it CDER or is it CDRH? CDRH being the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDER being the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So that's one of the things the 513G will tell you if you have combo is, you know, which center, is it CDRH or and what you do is you propose what you think it is, and then the FDA will tell you whether or not they agree. RFD output will include not only is your device, a combination product, or what is it, but they'll also specify the regulation and the product codes under which your device will be regulated. So the regulation, these regulations here where you see these large 800 numbers, usually it's like 860, I think, through 890 or something. Those are device-specific regulations, and the regulations establishes the classification of the device. So when you get your regulation number, you'll know whether your class is 1, 2, or 3, and then if it's 2 or 3, they'll give you the product codes that apply, and that'll tell you what your special controls are. Okay. RFD briefing document typically takes 10 to 25K to put together, and it takes 60 days from the time we submit it until we get a letter back from the FDA. There was one exception to that a couple years ago where they couldn't figure out what they were doing with software, and everybody waited 6 months to get their letter back. But they finally figured it out. So with respect to regulations and product code, this is the product code page off the FDA website. This is for a non-invasive blood pressure monitor. I don't know if you can read that or not. You can see here's the product code. It's DXN. Okay, here's the regulation. It also says submission type, 510K, and device class, class 2. Sometimes, if you see here, for class 2 device, you may see exempt. If it says exempt, that means you don't have to do a 510K. It's like a class 1 device. You just apply general controls. Okay. And then your product code lists the special controls, which I don't know if you can read these or not. I can't even read them. Stand right there. Let me go over to the computer. I forget which kind of standards these are. Oh. These are ISO 6160. Oh, these are like the 60601s. Okay. Okay. 60601 is the big medical device safety standard that just about everybody has to conform to. Next step, after we figured out if we're a medical device or not, and we know what our regulations and product codes are, then we have to figure out what our regulatory strategy is. Okay. So, can we find a predicate device or not? Okay, if we're class 2. If class 3, doesn't matter. Class 1 doesn't matter. Okay, but for class 2, can we find a predicate? And what's our quickest way to market? This is where some thought is recommended, because sometimes, particularly if you think you're going to find yourself in a de novo classification, you may want to look at initially launching a product that's just like a predicate device and then doing a de novo submission later. And the reason for that is you can get your product on the market faster, going through the normal 510K process, and then you can get the FDA comfortable with your product and understanding how it works. And then you can add the new features. And then when you do your de novo submission, all they're looking at is the difference between what you submitted under your 510K and what your de novo product has. Okay, so sometimes that's a better approach. Now the bad part is you can pay multiple user fees and have to build multiple submissions to do that. But again, it comes down to it's the least amount of pain.
Russ, for a product that you described that's sort of the split predicate approach that's ultimately going to need to go through the de novo pathway, when you'd mentioned before you're going to be essentially establishing special controls to the FDA with your de novo application so that they can provide that guidance to companies that come after. Is a good place, or I guess, where do you typically start on the process of, let's say if there's like 3 or 4 predicate devices that are coming into this split predicate, you're going to be pushing through a de novo pathway. I assume then it would be good to start with all the special controls or controls that are already applicable to each of the predicates, or is it almost you need to start from scratch and then really build
No,
up from there?
I think what you're suggesting is, you kind of scoop up all of the special controls for the predicate devices, even though they're spread across multiple device types. That predicate device was approved under, and we have to provide a substantial equivalence table that says, here's their intended use, here's ours, here's their technical characteristics, here's ours. You can see they're the same. And if they're not the same, pre-sub meetings, here we go. So pre-sub meetings are pretty free format, or free form, I should say. The way the pre-sub meetings go is you submit a briefing document to the FDA, and in that briefing document is a description of your device and a series of questions you want to get answered by the FDA. But when you ask a question to the FDA, you can't say, what do you want us to do? What you have to ask is, we believe the appropriate approach to address this issue is to do X. Do you agree with this? And then the FDA will say, yes, we agree, or no, we do not, and here's why. Okay, and they owe you the here's why. Okay. And it's that here's why, which is the most important part of the pre-sub, because that's what you got to take back and evaluate and incorporate into your design program. Like we talked about earlier, you'll get a set of meeting minutes that are mutually reviewed and approved by the FDA and the manufacturer participating. Take 60 days to set a pre-sub meeting, which is really inconvenient. If you need fast answers, you're not going to get them. Fastest way to get an answer is if you've got a project manager inside the FDA to go ask them. So a lot of times they will answer your questions informally, off the record. But always telling you that, well, I can't promise you this, but this is where we think it might go. Briefing document prep for pre-sub is between 15 and 40K, depending on the complexity of the device. And pre-sub can take the form of a face-to-face meeting, which is rare. Although if you have a de novo device, most likely you will have a face-to-face meeting. If you have a device that's fairly well understood but has some interesting wrinkles to it, you may get a teleconference. And if your questions are just kind of run-of-the-mill questions, you may just get written responses back to your questions in your briefing document. Of course, problems with these pre-sub meetings are, you mentioned, same as any submission, incomplete submission, they can't understand what you're telling them. And then on the flip side, you got their minutes back, but you didn't implement them correctly. So those are the common problems we see with pre-sub meetings.
So that's interesting.
So I like to point at this from time to time. This is a 5-phase, phase gate product development management system. Anybody familiar with these sorts of things? Seen this before? Sometimes they're called, I think PRTM refers to their version as PACE. We've got a lot of different flavors out there. But basically, I like to use this chart because for startup company clients, it kind of helps answer some of these questions that are on the board, like when do we do what things? Okay, so this has been built over a number of years of my colleagues having worked on a number of medical device developments and so forth, and kind of getting our knees skinned and learning that, boy, if we moved this up earlier, done this at this point instead of here, we would have been better off. Couple things to note, the blue boxes are regulatory records that we have to create for the FDA, either for submission or inspection or both. The green bar is our quality system development, okay, the steps we want to go through to develop a quality system, and then the white bars are other things that we need to do but may not be mandated by regulation. Okay. So a couple of thoughts to get us started. I'm not going to walk through everything, but most of the concern of the startup companies will be in this feasibility phase. What do I need to do here? Well, I'm fundamentally working with my technology and designing my product, and making sure it kind of works. What do I need to do? So the design, the regulation compliance starts in the planning phase. You notice we got this thing up here that says design and development plan. That's the start of the design control process. Then the development of its complementary set of design inputs. So we're going to start design control somewhere on this boundary. But there's things we can do in the feasibility phase that will help us get into this design control world. Design controls I refer to as design for compliance. Okay? You're complying with regulations, you're complying with standards, you're complying with FDA guidance. If you have a product whose technology is not fully matured to the point to where it these functions to some minimum level of performance, then you're wasting your time starting into design controls. I'll show you why here in a minute. So, but in the feasibility phase, as we're working through feasibility, what are the things we need to be cognizant of that can help us get prepared for the downstream work of regulatory compliance? If we're running any sort of clinical trials under an IDE, exploratory investigational basis, obviously those are going to take place somewhere in our feasibility phase. Starting the human factors program. Human factors studies fall into two categories. They're formative and summative. Formative studies are exploratory. They're looking for problems. Summative studies are confirmatory. They confirm we have adequate usability. So the summative studies will be out here in our system, in our design validation activities. But we can start our formative studies as soon as we want. Okay, and they can either be informal studies that we don't show the records to the FDA. But if we're smart about it, we can use our early formative studies and get credit for those as part of our overall human factors program. More importantly than just having the records of early human factor studies, this is the cheapest point in this feasibility phase. That's the cheapest point to correct use errors. Okay. You find use errors out here. We've got clients that we do a submission, send a submission into the FDA, and they said your human factors program is not adequate. You haven't proven sufficient usability for safety and effectiveness. And guess what? We get to back up and repeat our human factor studies. That's expensive, time consuming. So best to scrub all of the use errors out of your system in this phase when it's cheap to correct those errors than it is to wait downstream. Another thing that we want to do is we want to start our risk management program. I usually recommend that we start with a hazards analysis and a system level failure modes and effects analysis. Okay? Because that gives us sight line, and again, it's the whole idea that if we've got some fundamental risk we can't adequately mitigate, it's much cheaper to change the system design here in the feasibility phase and correct that and mitigate those risks than it is to get downstream and find out that we're in a painted ourselves in a corner. And believe me, if you've got unmitigated risk, the FDA will find it. client once. We did a very complex risk management program. It was a 3-step clinical process, used about 14 different medical devices throughout the process. And we did the risk assessments, and when we got done, the risk management team said, you've got one risk you haven't adequately mitigated. You've got a risk of the breakdown of sterility in the process. You need to be aware of that. We need to have mitigation for that. Management said, well, let's send in in this case it was an investigational device exemption. Let's send in the IDE and see what the FDA says. So we sent in the IDA, and the FDA says, you've got a risk related to the breakdown of sterility in your process. You've got to put a mitigation control in the process for that. So they won't miss anything. Another thing you need to be establishing in feasibility is user needs definition, okay? And user needs includes clinical performance requirements, okay? How good does this thing have to perform in the clinic? Okay. And if you've got a predicate device, you need to understand how they measure performance in your predicate, clinical performance on the predicate, because the FDA will expect to see comparable performance studies in your submissions. Okay. Any questions? This is a lot to digest in a short amount of time. Yeah.
Well, how much does this vary for class 1 510K exempt products versus class 2 and then a de novo or a PMA product?
This model does not vary as a function of device type. What will vary will be the depth of the particular activities that are involved.
So the regulatory and quality could vary depending on what's required, right?
Well, most likely
Product development doesn't really change.
Most likely things in system verification and design validation will change or be different.
Tell us more there.
If your product isn't sterile, you won't have any sterilization validation to do. If your product doesn't have software, you won't have any software validation or any software development records to do. We're going to talk about software at the end of this presentation because it's a monster all by itself. But this is this same model. I've used this model for pretty much every device I've worked on ever since I've had access to this model, and it's worked for all of them. So it's just the details that change.
Russ, I have a question.
Yeah.
So in the feasibility phase, you're developing your prototype to try and get it to some sort of decision point where you can say, okay, this is a feasible product, we're ready to move forward with it. So at that point, you'll get it to your first clinical study under an IDE. In most cases, you get the efficacy hit that you've defined based on your user needs, and you move forward. So I guess in the scope of the rest of the development of the product, there's a lot of design reviews, there's technical reviews and things such as that. Are those to make sure the device is more compliant with the controls that you uncover and any other complicated risk management issues that are going to come up as a requirement of that? So what I'm saying is almost all the design already addressed in the feasibility phase.
Yes.
And you've kind of locked down on, okay, we think this is what it's going to need to look like in production.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, we'll take it now through the formal process, make sure everything's double checked, done correctly, and then to the validation.
Exactly. And that's why we refer to design controls as design for compliance.
Okay.
Because if you're smart, you will have already had your design done.
Okay.
Like I said, to at least some, and this is where we're talking about a feasibility plan, where the feasibility plan defines, how good is good enough to transition into design controls. Is, what do we have to demonstrate to be willing to, take the increase in investment? Because when you enter into design controls, your burn rate starts to go up because you need more people. You start to do more testing activities. I've got a chart coming up here shortly that'll show that. But point is if you're not ready for design controls and you go into them too early, you will not be happy.
So Russ, I have not worked with, we just have quite a few class 1 devices running around here, and I'm also talking to lots of folks at all these mobile apps that are
Yep.
class 1s. I didn't think you had to do design controls
or you did a much mature version for a class 1 device, except if they have software or something, and how do you?
Design controls apply to all devices because it's part of 820, and 820 is part of the general controls, which if you remember,
Yeah, it's
Yeah. So part 820 and 820.30 is the design control regulations in part 820.
Right, is there a light design control you can use if you're?
Subsection
I mean,
A. Yeah, subsection A of 820.30 tells what the exemptions are for design controls.
Okay.
Okay, but I'm pretty sure that anything with software is subject to design controls. I'll have to go back. I've got a part 820 in my book or in my bag or somewhere. We can look at it later on.
Okay.
But yeah, it'll show what's exempt from design controls. But just about everything is required to have design controls because design controls are part of general controls. Oh, here we go. Don't leave feasibility phase too early. So we talked about starting risk management, human factors engineering, which, by the way, again, in the minds of the FDA, risk management, human factors are wired together. And those two functions are the backbone of design controls, okay? Particularly risk management, because risk management will control a lot of what you do in terms of verification and validation, okay? And then the other part is human factors will bring in elements into validation. So just remember that. The FDA does not see human factors and risk assessment or risk management being separate. And in fact, I've written probably more guidance documents on that than anything else I can think of. Regulatory compliance begins with design controls in the planning phase. It's helpful to define the measure of technical progress needed to enter into design controls. And there's a list of some sub-bullets there of things you might want to consider. I always throw product cost on there too, because if you're not sure how you're going to manufacture something and what you're going to be able to build it for, you might paint yourself into a corner downstream. So even though those are not regulatory considerations, they are important business considerations. Like we talked about, design controls are for design for compliance. And here's the kicker. This is why I say don't leave feasibility too early. Design iterations will cost you 3 to 10 times more once you cross the design control boundary. And the reason for that is you're dragging a huge pile of paper behind you and a whole bunch of test results. And if you have to repeat testing because you changed requirements, oh, you can almost read that chart, can't you? But here's the point. You can do things in feasibility cheaply, okay? Small team, buying stuff on Amazon or DigiKey or wherever your favorite vendors are. Cheap, easy, lab notebooks, As soon as you cross this line, quality system procedures. And by the way, no record created without a quality system procedure counts in regulatory. Okay, so if you did something out here you want to call design verification, and you didn't have a quality procedure that informed it, doesn't count. You got to redo it. Okay. Because all regulatory records have to be informed by quality system procedures. Okay. So as soon as you cross the design control boundary, your costs start to go up. You have to have more people, quality system procedures, lots of records management, document controls. It just goes up and up.
Russ,
Yes,
just
sir.
another question on that. So what level of verification procedure should be in place during the feasibility phase to help guide the iterative process towards something you think is going to be ultimately acceptable once design controls are there?
I like to define that in the feasibility plan.
Okay.
Yeah, the degree of, and here's why. The degree of verification you need will be variable depending on whether or not you're in an IDE. Okay. Because if you're in an IDE and you're going to do a clinical study, there's a guidance document out there. There's also ISO 14155 on clinical trial management. They both say basically the same thing, which is do not use a device on humans that you have not verified all the risk control measures for. Do I need to restate that? Because that's a fairly profound statement. Do not use a medical device on a human for which you have not verified all the risk control measures. Because it's not considered safe without verification of all the RCMs. Seems fundamental, but it was amazing to me how many companies trip over that. And that's what the guidance and the regulation, or the standard book tells. Okay, if you take design control training from me, you will get sick of this diagram. This is the FDA waterfall model for design controls. The white part is in the FDA design control guidance document. The other arrows at the bottom are all the stuff they left out. Okay? Because when they wrote the guidance document in, was it 2004, they hadn't thought through all these other bits and pieces that they now want. So we draw this, but I always get asked, well, where does risk management need to start? Well, when you start figuring out what your user needs are, you start identifying what your clinical hazards might be, that's where your risk management program needs to start, for example. And then, of course, if you're going to create legal records, then you have to have document control and record management, all those bits and pieces. So that's the FDA's view of design controls. I'm not going to go into great detail on that because that's a whole day's course all by itself. But are there any questions on the things we've covered since the break? Covered a lot of ground since then. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, so as Dane's heard me say dozens of times, start design controls with planning. Of course, I like to start anything with planning. You know, you don't fall prey to the 7 Ps, you know, the 7 Ps. Proper prior planning prevents piss poor performance. My wife hates that. She can only remember the piss poor performance part. I said, well, you got that down. So, but anyway, we've got this section of this is from the master flow chart that we looked at earlier. So we notice how we say quality system and design controls in the same breath. Because again, if we're going to comply with regulations, our quality system procedures have to guide us in that. So, no quality system, no design controls. Okay. First step is to create design and development plan, figure out what applicable standards and guidance. These are our special controls, right? There's also a set of controls that are not well communicated, unfortunately. But there are certain things that the FDA expects every medical device to conform to. IEC 60601, medical device safety is one. ISO 14971, risk management standard is another. If you've got software in your product, IEC 62304, which is a subordinate standard now, officially a subordinate standard to 60601. Both AAMI HE 75 and IEC 62304 for human factors are expected to be conformed to. So there's all these kind of things over the years that have crept in that the FDA now expects us to conform with. And but they haven't really, they kind of have told us through, but it's kind of indirectly. There's not a really sound promulgation of that requirement, or those requirements. One of the things I always encourage people to do in their DDP is create the test plan, the B&B test plan. Okay, even if you don't know all the bits and pieces, at least frame it as early as you can. And I've got a tool, one of the outputs of the system engineering process that the FDA expects us to use is a thing called the trace matrix, which is where we trace requirements to test cases. Okay, and they like that because they can pick up that one document and see the B&B status of everything from one document. I like to use the trace matrix in a preliminary form to define the B&B test plan, because then I know what design output I'm going to be creating, and I know what I have to test and how I'm going to test it. If I don't know, at least points it out to me that, hey, you got a gap, you got to figure it out. So test planning using preliminary trace matrix is my favorite approach to dealing with making sure we got all the bases covered. Along with this, like we talked about, we may need one or more pre-sub meetings with the FDA to figure out what our B&B program is going to be, particularly if we're in de novo. Excuse me. And once we get all this kind of front-end stuff done, then we can start to develop our device, okay, and follow our DDP in the process. DDPs have to be updated periodically. I recommend updating them prior to every design review so we can look at the updated plan and make sure that it's adequate for the next phase of development. If you do not have an updated DDP in your design history file, you will get a 483 observation from the FDA. because that's a regulatory requirement. That plans updated along the way. The other thing that's important for managers to understand, Dave, you may want to communicate this to Will, is the DDP, the design input, the project schedule, and budget are all legs of the same stool. Okay. You change the requirements, you gotta change your plans, you change your plans, your schedule, budget's gonna change. Okay. There's more to say about it than that. Okay. I've had companies try to ignore this fact over and over and over again. And guess what? It's like F equals MA. Proof's there every time. So it's always best to lock in your design input requirements before you begin device development, and make sure that your design and development plan tracks your design inputs. In other words, can this plan and this schedule and this budget deliver those requirements? That's the question I was asked. I asked it at a design review. Okay. Just had a design review a couple weeks ago. I asked that question. I act as an independent reviewer sometimes for companies. So
And Russ, that
yes.
often gets out of kilter, because the sales marketing folks are listening to early adopters or you know,
Sure.
soon to be thought leaders.
Yeah.
And in a small company, I guess you probably see less of this because it's a smaller core team, right?
Maybe not.
Okay.
It just depends on the personalities and who's attracted to what things and so forth. So,
Right, so what are best practices then to make sure that everyone stays aligned and you don't get off track?
your quality system procedures require it. In other words, your quality
Someone's
system.
checking it.
Yeah,
Someone's
your
checking
quality system procedures say if you change your design inputs, you
Got
have to review. The other thing that I like to have the design control procedures say is if you're going to have a design review, one of the things you're going to review is an updated design and development plan for the next phase. That way it's automatic. And that way you've got the records in your DHF you need and everything just falls into place. So to me, that's the best practice to keep yourself out of trouble. So speaking of quality system stuff, let's talk about how we get that set up. Talk a little bit about bootstrapping our quality system. I think Diane used that term earlier, and that's the term I frequently use. FDA says you can build a quality system for $20K. That's wrong. And I'll show you why it's wrong. Okay. Even a virtual company, first of all, you gotta count it up one day. I want to say there's something around 250 elements in Part B20 quality system regulations. Okay, that we have to conform to, depending on what we're doing and how we're doing it. And your business model, whether you're virtual or not, whether you're doing things inside or outside and so forth, has great effect on the number of procedures and what procedures you need. But if you're totally virtual, totally outsourced to the fullest extent, you'll have probably somewhere around 75 quality system procedures. Okay. So if you have people who know what they're doing, it takes about 16 hours to write, review, and approve a quality system procedure and get it into your system. So if you take 75 procedures times 16 hours times an internal cost of $125 an hour, which is fairly typical, 150K. So I don't know how you name that tune for 20K. And if you've got a more expensive quality system, then you can get up to 250K or more. I've seen some go 350, 450, depending on how many procedures they have. The other thing you have to remember, this gets into this balance. I think, Diane, you may have asked this question. You know, how much is enough? Keep in mind, quality system is going to cost you about 150K a year at a minimum to maintain it, because it requires experts to maintain it, requires document control, records management, compliance with training. Oh, did we mention training? I work for a lot of large companies. I've been trained on document controls, I think, by every company on the planet almost. Because if I work in their system, I have to be trained on document controls. So the balance, if you're going to bootstrap your quality system, the balance is to have the procedures you need for compliance in place and no procedures you don't need at that point in time. And so I sent Dane a quality system development roadmap a few weeks back, which kind of shows by the project phases. Let me back up so it's clear what we're talking about. By those phases, what quality system procedures need to be in place for what phase? Okay. And if you want to go full boat, compliance and feasibility, and Dane, that's those procedures that I show in the feasibility section, those are the ones you would need. But if you're not going to go full compliance and feasibility, then you can hold off some of those until you get into the planning phase. Okay, to bootstrap, here's kind of the minimum procedure set I recommend that a company starts with to bootstrap their quality system. Get started. And you can see it addresses all the things I talked about in terms of early stage, get started on, sorts of things. Document control and records management are the two most fundamental procedures. If you don't have those, you don't have a quality system. Period. So, we're developing our device now. We've got our parts of our quality system in place. We're generating records for submission. So when do we submit? Okay. So, like if you remember the big diagram at the beginning that had the big circle on it and stuff, if you remember, our submission is going to be based on the records that are in our design history file. Mostly our B&B records. They may ask for a few other things. They'll ask for trace matrix, they'll ask for some software records. Depending on the level of concern, that's something that we need to talk about with Dane's group, level of concern for software. And like I talked about earlier, quality system, or the submission records, quality system records have to be informed by quality system procedures. From time to time, we'll see FDA reviewers say, oh, send us your procedure for design controls. We want to see how that works. Or they'll ask for your procedure for risk management or something. We were getting those questions very early on combination products when the Part 4 regulations first came out. Records created outside a quality system cannot be used as submission because they're not considered viable legal records or objective evidence, as the lawyers like to call it. So to make all this work, you got to build your quality system concurrently, so hence the bootstrapping that we talked about. And if you're unclear of what you need to do or how you need to do things, you can always use a pre-sub meeting for that. I had a client, first combo, not first, but one of the first combo product clients I had. And I went in and Part 4 regulations includes design controls, Part 4 being GMPs for combo products. And I went in and I said, you need to have design controls in place now. And they said, oh no, we've worked it out with the FDA. And we don't need design controls. We've already got that covered. I said, well, that's interesting. So I said, well, you're going to have a pre-sub meeting coming up soon, correct? He said, yeah. I said, well, let's ask that question again. Okay, just to be safe. And this was a small pharmaceutical company, so they didn't want to have any hiccups. So I said, okay, we'll ask again. So we put it in and said, does the agency agree that we don't have fall design controls? And their answer was, absolutely not. Definitely have fall design controls because it's part of the Part 4 regulations now. See, this client hadn't kept up with the change, so that's why we asked again.
So did the answer change from FDA or the regs change?
The regs changed.
Okay, so when they answered the first time, they were correct.
They were correct.
FDA was correct. It's
Yeah.
just that the regs.
But the regulations changed and they didn't know it.
Right.
Okay. And so, and I told them regulations would change, they didn't want to believe me. I said, well, okay, what's that FDA? So they did, and they got their answer.
And by the way, FDA's answers just sometimes change even without a reg.
Well, of course.
But at least that one's a little more sane because they're actually following the regs. Yes.
Right. So the takeaway from this slide is know what you have to do in verification and validation for your submission and plan for that early in your development program, because if you get to your submission building and you don't have the records you need, it's too late. So let's say we got our submission built, we've sent it into the FDA, now what happens? Okay, So let's say we did not get a refusal to accept letter. Okay, the FDA said, okay, we'll take your submission, looks okay. And they evaluated it, and you did some wrangling on your 510K. By the way, most 510Ks you will get at least one round of questions and usually two. Okay, which is why we go from 90 days to 140 to 180 days, because of the questions involved. But usually, if you've done all the work you need to do, you will have what they ask for. Okay, or they will ask for a clarification. You said this, we're confused. Can you clarify this for us? And so you send in some document or some explanation. Then they go away happy. So now they've said, sent you your clearance letter. They said, okay, yes, you're cleared. You can distribute your market now across state lines. Distribute your market, no, distribute your device across state lines. So then, great, how do you do that? Well, the first thing you got to do is you have to register yourself as an establishment, medical device manufacturer in some form. And we'll talk about the various forms that the FDA recognizes. Okay? And in addition to establishing your registration with the FDA, you have to list your device. Okay? And when you do those two things, it puts you on the FDA's Office of Compliance schedule for inspections. So they now say, oh, we just got a new establishment and we just got a new medical device and they're distributing that, so we've got to set up an inspection. So within the first year or two of your product listing, you can expect the FDA to, if you're in good shape, call you up and say, hey, we'd like to schedule an inspection. If you're misbehaving, they will show up without notice and give you an inspection. So it's the combination of registration, establishment registration, and product listing that triggers your inspection schedule. So that's important to know. And some companies will register their establishment in their pre-launch phase, but hold their product listing until they actually start distribution, just to make sure they don't start their inspection clock any sooner than they have to. All right, so that's the basic drill on the process front to back. Are there any questions about that before we talk about some more specific topics like outsourcing? All right, well, let's move into outsourcing. So like I told Dane this morning, outsourcing doesn't make things easier, it makes things harder. A lot of people, especially my startup company clients, think that because they have a manufacturer that has a ISO 13485 certification, that they do not need a quality system. That's not true. If you're a manufacturer of record, you need a quality system, even if you're outsourcing. If you're having someone else develop your software for you, you need to have software development quality system procedures, because you're managing the software. And software management doesn't just involve the development of the code, it also involves the management of code changes and the release to the field. And that's where the manufacturer of record gets it. So keep that in mind. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to software. So everybody outsources today. It's interesting because the FDA regulations were not built for outsourcing. When the FDA originally wrote their regulations, they were thinking everything was in one box: design, manufacturing, service, everything. Okay. Well, over time, that's changed. So the FDA's had to stretch the regulations to cover all these various outsourcing scenarios. So if you outsource your manufacturing, you're still a manufacturer of record, which means that you have the regulatory responsibilities. You can delegate your regulatory activities, but you cannot delegate your responsibilities. So for example, someone else can build the device history record for you in manufacturing, but you have to account to the FDA that DHR is under appropriate control. Okay. If you outsource, and in terms of you don't manufacture, but you have someone do it for you, you then become a specification. That's the FDA's title for someone, because you're writing specifications to which someone else is manufacturing the product. Like I just said, you can delegate your activities, but not your obligations. If you're outsourcing, you have to have really strong purchasing controls. Okay, and the purchasing controls will combine with design controls if you're using outsourced development partners. For example, I've got slides on warning letters from the FDA. One of the warning letters I remember was company got cited because they had a series of surgeons do their validation studies in an IDE, but they never qualified the surgeon group as being qualified to do validation. So they were in big trouble because now their validation records were invalid. That's not a good place to be. If you're outsourcing, it's going to cause you, if you're a small company, an emerging company, it's going to cause you to accelerate your bootstrapping. Okay, because you're going to have more procedures in place sooner. Okay, because you're doing work on the outside that you have to control through your purchasing control system. And then the other thing we have to recognize is there are certain controls, management responsibilities, design controls, CAPA. Maybe they're considered overarching, which means that if you're outsourcing, you better understand how your responsibilities dovetail with your suppliers who are doing those things for you. So if your supplier has a CAPA program, you're going to need a CAPA program too, but your CAPA program is going to dovetail with their CAPA.
Russ, a question on this.
Sure.
So for our product specifically, there's the sort of several functional blocks of the product, with one being the hardware and electronics, which carry, I guess, a lot of the significance in that they determine whether or not the device is going to be, I guess, efficacious or not. In that they're doing the reading, they're doing the interpretation, which is separate and apart from some of the other suppliers we're thinking of bringing in to help us develop the product. So given that we're going to need to put into place a lot of design controls to manage those suppliers, I guess would the optimal strategy then be to push off those supplier developments as far back as we can and try and de-risk the aspects that we have in-house as quickly as possible? Or I guess what's the strategy in those sort of scenarios?
Okay, so keep in mind that when we're talking about quality system requirements and regulatory responsibilities, we're talking in the design controls that have already started. Okay. So you can do pretty much what you want in feasibility and with whatever suppliers you want, and not have any regulatory obligations, unless you want to carry those records that were created into your DHF for use later in your submission or your inspections. Then those would need to be informed by quality system procedures. Those records would need to be informed by quality system.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, but again, feasibility is a little more flexible. You've got more elbow room there.
So related to that, would you suggest ever trying to take feasibility documents and move them into, establish a quality system that early, or would you say that you need to have solid feasibility before you bother moving along? Have you seen startup companies you've worked with successfully pull something from the feasibility study through by setting up a system early on, or?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways you can do that. Probably the best way to do it, in the design control procedures set that I work with my clients, there's a provision there's what's called a project initiation form. And what the project initiation form does is it draws a very clear line to when design controls start. Okay, the reason for that is that keeps the investigators out of anything that's feasibility. They don't have purview to that, okay? They only have purview to the things that were done from the regulations. So we draw that hard line. But in that form, we get to say what documents we're bringing across from feasibility to use and develop, okay? And the concept being that those incoming documents would be reviewed by a design control board to assure their adequacy. Now, one of the things we want to do if we did that is we would want to think about what did our deliverables and feasibility do, and can we predefine for the feasibility deliverables what they would need to have in them to conform with our future quality system procedures. And since the quality system procedures are going to be an interpretation of the regulations, and we already know what the regulations are, we can determine that, okay, if we use this form, okay, which is the form we're gonna use for design controls, and we put our risk assessments on these, and we review them and approve them, just like we would at design controls, and then when we put them through a design review, bringing them into the design control process, then they become full design control records. Okay, but we have to do that kind of thinking in advance to do that. That's all, it's all doable and it works, so. It's a great question. Excuse me. I have no idea what's going on here. Okay, here we go. This is a page from the FDA's website at the link in purple, see there. And of course, the typing is so small, no one can read it. Okay, so I will interpret it for you. The blue line at the top says contract manufacturer. Okay, and what the columns here say register, list, and pay. Pay meaning pay user fees. Okay, and if you notice for a contract manufacturer, the answer is yes, you have to register, yes, you have to list. When you list the medical devices you're manufacturing for other people. Okay, and you have to pay user fee because you're going to get inspected by the FDA. Okay. If you're a full manufacturer, that means everything's under one roof. That's the standard model. Nothing, everybody knows you got to register, list, and pay for that. If you're a specification developer, which means you're not manufacturing, you're just developing and outsourcing manufacture, then you notice, and this is hard to tell, but the answer is yes, 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 and yes also. You have to register, you have to list. And what you will do is you will list your product, and you'll tell the FDA in your product listing where it's being manufactured, and the FDA will cross-reference that to the contract manufacturer and their listing. Okay. So they'll know who's doing what for whom. If you have a virtual company, okay, and you're the manufacturer of record, so let's look at this, and let's say this is software development, our device, contract manufacturing on the outside, okay? Your quality system has to stretch over all of it, okay? Your software developer becomes a specification developer consultant, according to the definitions. That was one of the names that's on that chart that was on the previous slide. You're a specification developer consultant. You are the manufacturer of record. If it's your device, your name's on the, and an address is on the device. And then the contract manufacturer, they may be on there too, and it says manufactured for company X by company Y. We talked about design change management, change control. Always a big issue when you're outsourcing. Okay. What is your contract manufacturer obligated to tell you about? And what can they do on their own? Okay. That has to be defined through your contracts, your manufacturing contracts with your CMOs. Okay. We already talked about the linkage between purchasing controls and design controls if you're using outside resources for like testing, so forth. If you want to use Intertech or UL to do 60601 testing, then they have to be qualified in your quality system as a supplier. Beyond what the FDA calls an approved supplier list. Supplier evaluations, the first step is you define the requirements of what you need from a supplier. No requirements, you get a 483. Everybody know what a 483 is? When the FDA does an inspection, if you have a gap in your quality system, they write it down on what's called Form 483. And in the industry, if you talk about 483s, those are quality system gaps that the FDA has cited before. So we call them 483s. The FDA calls them 483s. So you will get a 483 if you don't have supplier requirements. If you don't have records of supplier evaluation, you'll get a 483. If you don't have records of supplier monitoring, you'll get 483. Okay, because all of those things are elements of the regulation under 820.50 purchasing controls. Kind of feel like, you ever seen that movie Cool Hand Luke? That one scene where the new convicts come in and the guy says, you do this wrong, you spend a week in the box, and do that long, spend the night in the box. Your contracts with your outsourced suppliers need to make clear what their regulatory obligations are versus yours, and who's holding what records. Okay? Had a situation with a big pharmaceutical company was buying some device components from an overseas company, got into a recall situation. FDA asked the pharmaceutical company to provide them with the design records for the device. Pharmaceutical company went to the overseas device manufacturer and said, "We'd like your design records." The overseas manufacturer said, "You can't have it. They're proprietary information." And pharmaceutical manufacturer said, "But the FDA wants them. We need them for the FDA." The overseas manufacturer said, "We don't care. They're ours. We have no contractual obligation to provide them to you." Okay? So your contracts have to be clear on what you have rights and access to in terms of their documentation and their records. Because otherwise you'll get hung up like that. Get a week in the box.
Where do you typically get those, I guess, counsel for drafting those sort of contracts? Is that going to require a attorney with expertise in this specific field, or are they pretty boilerplate as far as, you know, typically how these business contracts are laid out?
The general requirements, so the way I like to structure the agreements are you have the overall business contract, right? That's the legal underpinnings in terms of, you know, how we'll interact with each other on a business-to-business basis and what our legal obligations are to each other. Underneath that is a quality system agreement. The quality system agreement says, here's how their quality system and our quality system will interact. Okay, and then underneath that is the design and development plan that says, for this particular product or device, this is how it's going to fit into our two quality systems together. Okay, so you have those kind of three-layer details: business to business, quality system, device to the quality system. Okay, and that way you make sure you got all the bases covered. With respect to the overall clauses that need to be in the contract for that, generally I can help my clients figure out the what in terms of what needs to go in the contract, but we usually get an attorney to actually write the clauses so they're legally, binding.
Dave, my experience has been that, in fact, you don't want your quality system agreement embedded in your business contract.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of your business changes, you want to have those decoupled. So we've seen a lot of times that folks have nestled them up in there, and it's just a general provision. And you also don't want to hold up negotiations around what elements of data you need access to in the quality system, because you maybe want to get the engagement started on the business side, right?
Yeah.
So you get the business contract signed, and depending on your inside expertise there, you may or may not use a lawyer to help you on that to mitigate risk. And then typically your quality consultant, your quality head would want to be very involved with the elements of the quality system agreement, and that's where you might evolve that as your relationship grows from prototype developer, right, to potentially they can do the first clinical trial grade devices. So because that's going to be changing, and that quality system agreement will change over time too.
Gotcha, makes sense.
Things to think about in your contracts and your quality agreements are things like failure analysis. Units come back from the field that don't work. Who's responsible for that? And it costs money to analyze those returns and figure out what went wrong and do root cause analysis on them. Who pays for that? Okay, so that's frequently missed in contracts. With contract manufacturers that aren't used to doing medical devices, is things like that. Who has access to training records? Because they have to demonstrate that their people are trained, or you have to demonstrate that people are trained. So if you want them to do it, then you have to make sure their records are adequate to withstand, an inspection. So like I say, outsourcing makes things a little more complicated. Let's take a quick jaunt around inspections and enforcement. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but excuse me. The FDA, that picture in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of the QSIT manual cover. QSIT manual is the quality system inspection technique. It tells investigators how to sample a quality system and what to look for when they do an inspection. It's got 4 rails on it: management responsibility, design controls, corrective action, and process and production controls, which is the 4th thing I couldn't remember. From those 4 quality system elements, they can get to everything else. We mentioned 483s. If you don't conform to quality system regulations, then you will get a 483 observation. You have to commit to a time frame to close up your 483s. In some cases, you can close them up while the FDA is still there. They say, well, you know, this record of sterilization validation hasn't been approved. Well, you can go off and get that approved for your quality system procedure and bring it back and show it to the investigator and they go, okay, check that one, it's fixed. You might have something else that's a lot hairier, like a design control deficiency, and that might take months to change, in which case you have to give them a plan, and you have to demonstrate that you're conforming to your plan as you work through it. And there'll most likely be 30 or 90-day kind of updates to the FDA where you have to show progress to your plans for closing up your 483s. So, starts with inspections, and then if you don't get your 483s closed up to their satisfaction, usually you have to respond to the 483s and tell them how you're going to close them up. Sometimes if you write them your response and they don't like your response, they will issue a warning letter. Warning letter is the first step. In enforcement, it goes to the CEO of a company, and the CEO has 15 days to respond. If they don't respond, then they're subject to legal and civil penalties, or criminal and civil penalties. So, and back in 1988, I believe it was, there was a Medical Device Act Congress put through, which basically gave the FDA teeth, and it was about a year or 2 later, the FDA rounded up the entire management contingent of C.R. Baird and threw them all in jail, just to demonstrate that the new sheriff in town. So, it's serious business. The FDA can put you out of business, and have done that frequently because companies wouldn't comply with regulations. So they want you to comply, they want to help you comply, but they don't care about your profits, they don't care about your timelines, they don't care about anything other than you get your butt in compliance. And they're pretty adamant about it. So best to not get in that kind of condition. So that's all on enforcement. Just wanted to put that out there because that's the unhappy part of dealing with the FDA. Besides the fact that, you know, they don't get your submissions to you when you'd like to have them. And the other part is they come in and inspect you and they don't like what you're doing and they give you a warning letter. So. Final module for today is recommendations for software. Software is a different kind of animal. So much of our device functionality is rooted in software these days that the FDA has, and the FDA has seen so many adverse events and recalls and so forth associated with software that they're all over software. And in fact, when we do a 510K submission, we have to do a whole module just on software. So let's talk a little bit about what they want to see. And the bold title there in the middle of the screen, that is the guidance document for software, the software sections for any submission where a computer is involved. 510K, de novo, PMA, NDA for a combo product. If you've got a device and the device has a computer and the computer runs on software, you have to conform to that guidance document. That guidance document defines a software engineering process, or rather the records that come out of a software engineering process that the FDA expects you to conform to. Okay. And I've seen a lot of submissions get hung up for software problems. Software level of concern. So in that guidance document, there's a set of tables that help you determine what your software's level of concern is. Level of concern is minor if there's no potential for injury. A lot of times we'll see things like software apps that are fairly benign in their output. Fairly benign, meaning very low risk, would be judged minor level of concern, but very few devices are, primarily because the FDA wants to see a broader record set than the minor category calls for. And by the way, these categorizations affect what you send into the FDA in terms of records, but they don't change what the FDA expects you to do in terms of the entire software development process. Okay, and the entire software development process is described through the standard IEC 62304. So if you want to see what that looks like, go look at that standard. But so they expect you to conform to 62304, but they expect you to send in varying piles of records depending on your level of concern. So a lot of people think that, well, if I'm minor level of concern, I don't have to conform to 62304. And it's like, no, you still have to conform. You just send in fewer records. Major level of concern, most class 3 devices are major levels of concern, and anything used in conjunction with a drug. Table 1 in the guidance, question number 2, how do I know this? is this device used in conjunction with a drug? If you answer that yes, you're automatically major level of concern because of the risks involved. Russ's recommendations for medical device software development. Don't attempt to develop medical device software without personnel knowledgeable in medical device software development on staff. I've seen so many companies get wrapped around the axle because they outsourced their software and they didn't have anybody on the inside that knew anything about software. That's nothing. It's just asking for trouble. Don't attempt to outsource software development without the requisite set of quality system procedures. Because your software vendor is a supplier, suppliers are subject to purchasing controls. Purchasing controls mean you got to do all that stuff. Plus now, if they're doing development, they've got, you've got overarching responsibilities relative to design controls and CAPA and a few other things. If you're going to outsource, remember this morning, Dane, I talked about the ISO model for outsourcing. This is it in text form. So if you're going to have people on the inside directing software development, and you're going to have your software developed on the outside, what are your internal people? Well, here's what they do. They deconstruct software requirements from design input. Okay? Why do your internal people do that? Because that's what you're going to buy from your supplier, is those software requirements. So you better know what you're buying, right? They have to contribute to the hardware requirements definition because the software requirements have to reflect the hardware it's going to play on, right? So they need to understand the hardware requirements so that they can extrapolate the software requirements from that. They have to review and approve software development partner plans, verification protocols, test cases, things like that, because you have to have control over the software development program. Your internal people should participate in code reviews at the software development partner. And then your internal people will conduct software validation testing. So why do they do validation testing? To prove that you got what you ordered. Okay? And then finally, assembling software records for regulatory submissions. And then, is it up there? No, I left one off. There's another important bullet up here. They have to be responsible for releasing code revisions and updates to the field. Okay? And you'll get yourself in a world of hurt if you let your software supplier send software out to the field without your looking at it. We had a situation back in the 90s when one of the implantable pacemaker manufacturers had that happen. Somebody in their software development group sent code directly out to the manufacturing floor with no approvals. The FDA was considering pulling implantable pacemakers out of people's chests because of that. Okay, because they were so worried about what that meant in terms of the performance of the product. Now, fortunately, the manufacturer scurried around and got the problem fixed and was able to correct it. But that's how serious they are. The FDA is about software. So control of software means control from the point of its generation out to the end user. You have to control all those steps. And if you don't, then you get 43 or lots of them. And by the way, design control related 483s are the hardest to remediate. I always say it's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. All right, now that I've brightened your day on software, let's go through the questions. See if I answer them. So the distinction between research and development and impact on quality management system, do we need to say any more on that? I did an adequate job on that. Okay. How best to create regulatory submission documentation? Well, I think we've seen that you create it on the fly through your B&B program, and knowing what you have to create for your submission. A lot of times in fact, we'll probably want to do this for you, Dave, is get a table of contents for your submission and build that, and then that'll tell us what records we have to put in our submission. That'll tell us what records we have to develop in our B&B plan. So, yeah.
I guess, so I was the one who asked the question about the distinction between R&D to QMS.
Yeah.
So something you mentioned was establishing the project initiation form. So that's basically what you need to do to prepare for the design controls implemented in the QMS.
Well,
early
that
feasibility.
would be the first step of design controls, and your design control procedure should say that your project initiation form is the means by which you initiate a project under design controls. Yeah.
Okay, and that gives you more freedom to answer some more of these early feasibility research questions.
Yeah, it basically keeps the FDA out of your feasibility records and just allows you to do what you need to do in feasibility. And then in that form, you can define what things you want to bring across as parts of your DHF coming out of feasibility. But they would need to go through a design review and to check to make sure they conform to your quality system procedures at that time for you to do that. But that way you can leverage off of your feasibility work and bring that into your DHF if you desire to do that. That's beneficial for you. When and how do design controls come into play? Do we need more clarification on that? Was I clear on? Okay, good on that. Now, one thing I didn't address is I didn't address the differences between FDA and SFDA China. First off, as soon as we get outside the FDA, any other market in the world, they have a different regulatory model. Okay, Canada has a model, Australia has a model, Brazil has a model, Europe, of course, has their own model, and it's changing because next year we've got the MDRs and the IVDRs coming in. So they're going from directives to regulations. So the regulatory models are different, the device classifications are different, the guidance documents frequently are different. The ex-US regulatory model tends to focus more on compliance with standards and less on clinical data, but that is changing rapidly now because of the MDRs. The MDRs are going to look more like the FDA program in terms of emphasizing clinical data and emphasizing safety and efficacy proof as opposed to just conformance to standards. For a long time under the directives, the Europeans just conformed to standards, hardly ever did any clinical testing unless it was just absolutely mandated by EMA or somebody. So, but China has their own process. The best place to go, I've found, to find guidance on kind of all of these other ex-US regulatory processes is Emergo. Are you familiar with them? E-M-E-R-G-O, I think is the way it is. But they have an excellent, very colorful charts, shows each process for each country or each region of the world, what they expect, how they classify devices, and so forth. So look at that, that's helpful. And then the Chinese also have English language websites that you can go to that explain their processes and so forth. And they're actually pretty good. I've used them for at least one project. They were helpful. So that's about. I'm not an expert in China, so that's about all I can tell you.
So, I also has two questions. One thing is now has a lot of APP medical software program. They just set up on the cell phone,
Mhm.
and but for the medical. So how about that also need applying the certification like the medical device or?
It depends. We'd have to look at that because, like I said earlier, some cell phone applications that are medical devices are under what's called enforcement discretion. Okay, and that means that the FDA says they're medical devices, but we're not going to do anything about it. Okay, and there's a on the FDA website, fda.gov. If you go out there, you can go into the device page and type in mobile medical applications. Okay, and there's a guidance document that will pop up that will define, where the enforcement discretion is being applied and how it's being applied and so forth. And it also gives you guidance on if you are a medical device and you're not under enforcement discretion, what you have to do to conform to the regulations. So that's a helpful guidance document to look at.
So how often does the regulatory update in FDA?
How often do they update?
Yeah, there has
So
lots of update or no?
Well, yes and no. So let me talk about, because there's tiers of regulations and guidance. The regulations hardly ever change, okay? The last regulation I know of that changed was the Part 4 regulations for combination products that I talked about. That was the last, and before that we had the MDDS regulation for computer systems. Excuse me. But the regulations don't change very often because the regulations require Congress to act to change the regulations, okay? However, underneath the regulations, so the regulations say what the policies are with respect to what the law requires of medical devices and manufacturers. Underneath that are FDA guidance documents, okay? And other FDA sources of information. Those change frequently. And in fact, the FDA's probably done more guidance documents in the last 5 or 10 years than they had the sum total their entire history prior. They were criticized for not doing enough guidance, and so they've drowned everybody in guidance documents now. So there's lots of guidance out there. In fact, there's so much that comes out, I can't keep track of it all. I get notifications of what's come out, and it's like, oh, I'm going to read that, and then it's like, well, I don't read it unless I have a client that needs it, because there's so many of them coming out. So yeah, so track the guidance documents. The Federal Register shows Part 21 of the Federal Register is where all the food and drug regulations are. So you can get set up so that you can get like an RSS feed or something when those change, but those don't change very often. But the guidance do. So and they're hard to keep track of. Top hurdles to medical device development. So did we get those answered? You got an idea? It's kind of like the top 3 is V&V and software. So make sure you understand how you're going to handle those.
So here's a question for you.
Yeah.
Have you worked with startups that tried to do the feasibility and prototype development within an academic lab? And would you caution against that or say it can be done?
It can be done, yeah.
So one of the key, I guess, the key things, because typically, I mean, the advice that at least we life science entrepreneurs like to do is we kind of like to get it out of the academic lab for lots of reasons. Not just to, it's not just regulatory reasons at all. But I'm curious if we did, so if we can make an STTR or an SBIR grant work and get to a prototype where you're, able to do feasibility and lock the prototype. Any ideas there of when you've seen that work, what were the right formulas to make that work, I guess? Because you said
yeah, you can make it work. It's not easy. Okay, and the reason is it's like the academic environment is just different from the regulated environment, and the thought processes just aren't the same. You know, if you tell people that, well, no, you have to put this report on this form, and if you don't, it doesn't conform to quality system procedures, academics generally don't like that because that's not what they're used to. And so, again, it depends. Now, you know, in pharmaceutical companies, you know, they have big, elaborate research groups that do all kinds of stuff, and they have a variety of different, like electronic lab notebooks and other things that they do. But several of my large pharma companies have their quality system separate for R&D from their operations group. It's a different environment. So it can be done, not easy. Mindsets have to be right. Training has to be applied. It's a culture mindset. Yeah, it's one of, we're doing this because we want to be compliant out the gate, and people have to see the value in doing it that way. So.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah. So yeah, no, great question. IVDs versus medical devices. So we really didn't talk much about IVDs. IVDs, I believe, were the first combination products. They were the first products to combine chemistry and devices together. Okay, and it's interesting because a lot of the things we see in the in vitro diagnostic world are very similar to the things we see in the pharmaceutical world, particularly around the reagent side of the business. So in Europe, of course, we've got two different directives, and now next year, two different sets of regulations for devices versus IVDs. The reason IVDs are different is because they're more complicated than a regular device. They have the element of chemistry brings in risk. In my risk management training, I've got a slide that shows a Venn diagram, and one circle is drug and the other circle is device, and then when you have a combination product, the two overlap and create new kinds of hazards that the drug or device by themselves do not present. And it's the same with IVDs. When you add reagents on instrumentation and measurements, you end up creating new kinds of hazards that weren't present in just the device or just the reagent by itself. So, and in drug delivery, we always say the device causes the hazard, but the drug causes the harm. Right? It's very similar in IVDs. The device is what screws up, but it's the reagent that ends up reporting a bad result or whatever. So I don't know if I'm answering your question about the differences, but or what you had in mind. Do you need more detail there? Or?
Well, as I said, I think I'll have the number and I take
Okay.
and we can dive in.
Okay. Yeah. And then you've got inside the FDA, you have the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics, which is a whole separate office of. They're part of, I believe they're part of CDRH, but they've got a completely different mindset about how they look at things because IVDs are just different animals.
Does that division remind me organizationally also oversee CLIA labs and LDTs?
No, CMS oversees. Yeah.
That's through CMS.
That's why I was talking about Part 492 quality system.
Right.
Part 492 is a CMS regulation. Okay. So, and it's completely different. It kind of looks, 492 kind of looks like if you've ever seen ISO 17025 for lab testing lab services. 492 looks similar to it. So yeah, IVDs are just different animals, and they're treated differently by the FDA. All right, well, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. There are other backup slides in this presentation. There's a couple of org charts for the FDA and some other things, more examples of warning letters and things that I just threw in that we don't have time to talk about today, but might be helpful for you to look at to provide a little more depth to what I said today. Before we wrap up, any other questions or needs of group? Yeah.
So I guess expanding on the sort of international regulations conformity. So if you conform properly to the FDA regulations, would you say that they are sort of the gold standard for then sort of ramifying into entering other markets and going through
yes their... No. So one of the things we need to recognize is that medical device regulations are also trade barriers. Okay. So what typically happens is you have the local authorities in the various countries or groupings like the EU, okay? They will twist or bend around certain regulatory requirements to make them different from the other countries. So for example, if you look at Canada, Canada is very similar to Europe in terms of their general regulatory structure, but Canada has what's called CAMCAS. And CAMCAS is a hybrid between FDA and the EU regulations. So it's doubly confusing. There's no, unfortunately, because of the trade barrier issue, because of the legal issues and the underlying laws in the various countries and so forth that are involved in the way medical device regulations are applied, you have to know in advance what markets you're going to go into and what you have to do to comply in each market. And if you're going to go into an ROW, rest of world kind of launch program, it's typical most of my clients will pick out like an order of launch by country or region, okay? And then that gives them time to kind of prepare the differences and the submissions. The basic underlying regulatory concepts are the same, okay? But the problem is the way they ask for information to be presented sometimes is different. My favorite example is in a lot of countries now, they're asking for human factor studies with their populace. They won't accept human factor studies from somebody outside their country because they're saying our population is just different culturally, the way we read things, the way we behave, and you could do a study in the US and have great usability. You could bring your product here and it'd fall on its face. So that's an example of the sort of differences that we're seeing market to market. So again, advanced planning is always the way to go. Okay, well, thanks for your attention today. Good audience.
Thank you, Russ.